Who taught you about your crafts?
I guess I learnt to knit at home with Mum and Grandma's, and continued that at school. And I also, Mum has always sewn. She made all our clothes when we were small children.
What crafts did you do at school?
I started school at the age of 4, so that was 58. So we're talking early 60s was when I learnt to knit and to do cross stitch. And most people were being taught to knit, but I already could knit and was knitting things rather than just things like dishcloths, which is what we all knit, because it was quick and easy and you produced something at the end of it.
Did you ever make your own clothes or knit?
I did an O-level in what was then called domestic science needlework, and we used to make clothes. We made our summer school uniforms, skirts for winter term and that sort of thing. There was a set pattern for making the summer dress. It had to be in a certain style in one of 2 fabrics, which were gingham basically, and it was either brown and cream check or blue and cream check. And it was sort of a dropped waisted thing that would fit anybody basically. There were pretty standard patterns that the school had, but everybody had to learn to adapt the pattern to their own sort of general size. Some were more successful than others.
Have you ever made things for your house?
I have actually run my own soft furnishings business, making curtains, cushions, bedding, valances and fancy things for bedrooms, loose covers for chairs and that type of thing. But for my own pleasures, so to speak, I paint. I'm doing a watercolour class at the moment. I'm also using acrylics and doing some only basic stuff. I'm no great artist. I also have in the past, but not recently, I knit, and I've always made sweaters and scarves, and I've knit for children, as we all used to do years ago. But that doesn't happen so much now because all the fleecy fabrics have taken over from hand-knitted things for babies. I mean, once somebody told you they were pregnant, everybody used to start knitting. It was just the way life worked in those days. I also do lots of woodworking things. I'd love a lathe, but I haven't got one yet, so I can do some wood turning. I'd like to find a course to do some wood turning, but that's next on my list along with ceramics. What else? I've done embroidery and also sort of cross stitching, which is slightly different. And those are the sort of things that I have enjoyed over the years. Yeah, and I still sew general things, and you know, skirts, trousers, that sort of thing. Yeah.
What craft do you do now?
I like doing practical things, and I like resolving things that maybe are a bit more difficult. Take any chair, and you've got to make a pattern to create a cover to go on that chair, that sort of thing. And with clothes, it was always being able to have something, one, that wasn't as expensive as it was in the shops. 2, it was about having something else that nobody else had ever got, because it didn't matter if everybody used the same pattern. If you all used a different fabric, you got a different dress. So, you know, when it came as a teenager and a young adult, in the sort of fashion stakes, you always had something that was a one-off. I mean, I can remember as a child unpicking hand-knitted sweaters so that the wool could be washed, rewound, and it was then balled up and re-knit into other garments, because there just weren't the raw materials around, or they were very expensive, the ones that were around. And the same with dressmaking and summer dresses and things like that. Most of my summer dresses as a child were made, I was the eldest, so they were made for me by my mum, but from the frock that she'd had the year before. And because the skirts were full, the fabric would be taken off the last summer's dress and then washed and ironed and reused with a smaller pattern for a child.
And then was that passed down
Through to my younger sister, who would get them well, she's 4 years younger than me, so she'd have to wait a few years until they got to her, if the fabric was still presentable at that stage of the game. My brother was the lucky one because he was the only boy, so he never had things that were handmade and hand-me-down, because boys didn't, girls did. Certainly as a child we never had, we used to have new sort of Whitsun clothes which were worn on Sundays and going to Sunday school and for parties and family gatherings and things like that. And we had playing out clothes which were generally denim and sort of coarser fabrics. And we got changed when we came home from school. We got out of our decent school clothes and had playing out clothes, and which were patched and darned and whatever. I can remember as a child that my mother had my ration book, although it was never used for me, because rationing was still in until the year I was born in 1954. Even though my ration book was issued to me, it was never ever used because rationing stopped that year. And prior to that, they hadn't been able to buy fabrics or wools. Everything was rationed. So my mum had grown up in the generation through the war, as a child during the war, of having nothing new. They grew all their own veg, they grew, you know, which is why all the sort of wools were recycled much in the same way as people are starting to recycle things. Nobody now would think to go, well, you can't buy fabric in the same way that you could when I was a teenager. Every market stall, every department store had a huge fabric department, wool department, and there were hundreds and hundreds of patterns to choose from. There were lots of big makes, and they were relatively inexpensive, and you could use them time and time again. And because you use a different fabric or slightly different style, shortened a skirt, lengthened a skirt, it was always different each time you reuse the pattern.
Who have you passed your craft skills on to?
Recently, one of my neighbour's children has asked me to teach them to knit. They've seen me knitting, and her mum can't knit, or hasn't shown her how to knit. So I've been asked to teach. She's 6 or 7 years old, and it's very, very difficult actually, when you're used to doing something automatically yourself, to actually slow it down enough to teach a child who doesn't understand the principle. So yes, I pass them on in that way. And 20, 30 years ago, I taught several people to knit who've gone on to carry on knitting for themselves. Most people have the basic skills to sew, but just can't be bothered anymore. And because you can now go shopping and pick up a t-shirt for £2, who wants to start making their own clothes? Unless it's someone who's got design flair and is really motivated to have something really different. I mean, my mum used to sew whilst we were at school, because the only place she could sew was either on the dining table we had a big living kitchen, or on the living room floor, because she needed a huge expanse of smooth flat surface to cut things out with, because the fabric needs to be laid flat, the pattern needs to be laid flat on the fabric and pinned and kept flat, otherwise everything distorts. So the only time she could do that was when we were either out at school or in bed at night. And when women started working, they just didn't have the time to do that.